This program will be recorded. Please make sure your audio and video are disabled. Interactions via chat will not appear on the recording. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Dan Garcia. I'm with the San Antonio Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to this Holocaust Learn and Remember program. I would like to introduce Ms. Reyna Stovall, who is our presenter for the evening. And there it is. Reyna Stovall is currently an undergraduate student at Fordham University in New York City. Ms. Stovall plans on studying international relations with a focus on human rights and the Holocaust. She has taken an active role in educating her community about humanitarian atrocities, both past and present. In her hometown of San Antonio, Texas, Reyna is a docent for the Holocaust Memorial Museum in San Antonio, where when she is not busy reading up on world affairs, Reyna enjoys musical theater, learning French, and watching science fiction movies with her family. This is Reyna Stovall.
Hi, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen real quick. All right. So this is Stories of Refuge, and while my presentation is about the Holocaust and stories of refuge during the Holocaust, there are currently more than 82 million refugees and displaced people around the world, the largest humanitarian crisis since World War II and the Holocaust. So while the stories I'll be telling are history, the experiences of people trying to find refuge are still very prominent and prevalent in the world today. So as a brief overview, I'll provide some basic definitions and background information before transitioning into the eve of war, wartime years, and post-war stories of refuge. And then I'll conclude with some closing remarks and then answer any questions you may have. Feel free to just put them in the chat, and then I'll get to all of them after my presentation is over. So I like to provide the definitions of both Holocaust and refugee because they serve as foundational terms that I'm going to be building upon and using a lot throughout the rest of my presentation. So the Holocaust was the state-sponsored systematic persecution and annihilation of European Jewry by Nazi Germany and its collaborators between 1933 and 1945. Jews were the primary victims of the Holocaust, and 6 million were murdered, but they weren't the only victims targeted in the Holocaust. During the era of the Holocaust, German authorities also targeted other groups because of their perceived racial inferiority. Roma, the disabled, and some of the Slavic peoples were some of the groups targeted by the Nazi regime. Other groups were persecuted on political, ideological, and behavioral grounds, such as communists, socialists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and homosexuals. The term refugee actually comes from a series of independent but related words with roots going back to Latin. Our modern use of the word refugee, however, comes directly from the French word refugee, which referred to Protestants who fled France following the revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. And this edict granted civil rights and religious liberties to the Huguenots. Our modern use of the word refugee is someone who has been forced to flee his or her country because of persecution, war, or violence. A refugee has a well-founded fear of persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. Most likely, they cannot return home or are afraid to do so. War and ethnic, tribal, and religious violence are the leading causes of refugees fleeing their countries. So the Holocaust and the refugee crisis that ensued didn't happen overnight. We can actually trace the initial catalyst to the end of World War I, which formally ended with the Treaty of Versailles. And although World War I was a world war, the entire blame was placed onto Germany. So following war reparations and the US stock market crash, Germany was in a deep, deep depression. Unemployment was through the roofs and inflation was very drastic. As an example of how bad the inflation was, people would actually burn money sometimes instead of buying wood because it was cheaper to heat their homes with the money than purchasing the wood with that money. Sometimes people would even use the money as scratch paper because it was a better use for it. So For part of the Depression in Germany, Adolf Hitler was in jail. He was jailed in 1923 for attempting to overthrow the Weimar Republic with the Nazi Party. And he was in jail from 1923 to December of 1924. And while he was in jail, he wrote his memoir, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, which outlined his vision for Germany and the German people. Upon his release, the Nazi Party began to mobilize, and they gave people the strength that they wanted. They talked about how the German people were strong and how German people were a good nation. And as a result, nationalism rose exponentially. And because of the Nazi Party's mobilization efforts, they gained 12 seats in the German parliamentary election in 1928. Also, in 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor by the president of Germany at the time, Paul von Hindenburg. And as a result, the Nazi Party took control of the German state. 1 month after Hitler was appointed chancellor, the German parliamentary building, the Reichstag, burned down due to arson. And the Nazi Party and Hitler used this event and fears in Germany of a communist takeover. They exploited the event, and Hitler had von Hindenburg grant him emergency powers. Along with this also came the stripping of liberties from the German people. They took away freedom of speech, freedom of press, and anybody who was suspected of being communist could be automatically jailed. So the Nazi Party exploited the event, and because of Hitler's decisive action in the face of this awful atrocity, he was cast as the savior of Germany and the German people. And as a result, his message and the Nazi Party in general were further mobilized and further accepted and celebrated by the German public. The Nazi Party also scapegoated Jews. They used anti-Semitism to vilify Jews. And an example of vilifying propaganda is shown on the screen. This is a tabloid advertisement, and it pictures a Jewish caricature, and the caption at the top says, "He came to Germany like this," with the caption at the bottom reading, "Without a solution to the Jewish question, there can be no redemption of humanity." This is just one example of how Jews were vilified in German society. They also institutionalized many of the racial theories present in Nazi ideology through the Nuremberg laws, which established who was Jewish and required Jews to wear a Star of David on their clothing at all times. So World War II officially began on September 1st, 1939, with Germany's invasion of Poland. Then sometime in 1941, Adolf Hitler authorized the European-wide scheme known for mass murder, known as the Final Solution. And I put the term final solution in air quotes because it was a euphemism that the Nazis created for the mass murder and cultural destruction of millions of people. On May 7th, 1945, the Nazis surrendered to the Allied powers, leading to the eventual end of World War II. While all of this was happening, many Jews tried their best to flee Nazi Germany in Europe, but it was a very difficult task because of immigration quotas and extensive documentation that was needed to leave. And a lot of Jews actually held out hope that the situation would pass, especially at the beginning years of the war, or that an Allied victory would provide them with the safety that they needed. There were a select few, though, who did leave Nazi Germany and Europe before World War II even began. And the Roseanne family is one such example. Alfred Roseanne, shown on the screen here, was born on July 20th, 1923. He was born in Vienna, Austria, and he had a father named Rudolf who owned a leather goods business. He also had a little sister. And as the children were growing up, Rudolf decided that they needed to get more fresh air. So they moved the family to the suburbs, but they returned to Austria, or Vienna, Austria, in 1933. And following Germany's annexation of Austria in March 1938, Rudolf decided that they needed to flee. He kind of sensed what was brewing and wanted to move the family outside of Europe. He tried to convince the rest of the extended family to go with them. And all but one section of their extended family actually did go. The one section that remained were awaiting American visas. And so they thought that they'd also be able to get out of Europe, immigrate to the United States, and that they would be safe and away from Nazi terror. But sadly, their immigration visas never arrived, and the family was deported to Auschwitz, where they were all murdered. For the family that did decide to go with the Roseannes, they first went to Poland, then to Moscow, where they boarded the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Vladivostok. Then they took a Japanese vessel to Shanghai, where they settled. Once they arrived in Shanghai, however, they weren't allowed to take money out of the country. So the Jewish community of Shanghai lent Rudolph and a few of his brothers money to open up a leather goods business store. And the business, once it was open, actually flourished. You can see at the photos at the bottom of the screen some of the workers who worked in their factory. But upon Japan's entry into World War II in 1941, the Roseannes weren't able to conduct business very well. And so for the rest of the war, they had to live off of their savings. After World War II ended, Alfred's sister married an American man and was able to immigrate to the US. His parents moved to the US and immigrated under sponsorship of a cousin who lived there. But because Alfred was under the age of 23, he was prohibited from filling their immigration quota, and he was stuck in Shanghai. So he had to find some other way to leave the country. So what he did was he got an Austrian passport and 2 transit visas, one to France and one to Canada. And then he left on the General Meigs, the last American ship to leave Shanghai prior to communist takeover. So he went to Austria, then to France, then to Canada. And then in March 1949, he entered the United States. But because he entered on his transit visas and not through an American visa, he technically remained an illegal immigrant afterward. The Roseanne family weren't the only family that escaped to Asia during the Holocaust. There were actually thousands of Jewish refugees who moved to Asia during the Holocaust. And this brings me to my first book recommendation of my presentation. I am doing this through the public library, so I figured I would give you all some resources through the library if you are interested in some of the stories that I'm telling and some further reading to educate yourself or to learn more. And I have an official slide at the end with all of the recommendations that I'm going to give throughout my presentation. So I'll leave it up for a few minutes afterward, and you can take a screenshot if you'd like, or a picture with your phone. Escape to Manila from Nazi Tyranny to Japanese Terror is by Frank Ephraim, who moved to Manila during the Holocaust with his family. And in this book, he talks about 36 stories from people who moved to Manila. And they often talk about the struggles of moving to a different country where they didn't know the language, as well as what it was like to live under Japanese rule after living under Nazi rule. So if you're interested in this book, it's available through the San Antonio Public Library in physical form. The MS St. Louis was a German luxury cruise liner that was supposed to carry more than 930 Jewish refugees to Cuba during the Holocaust. And a lot of the people on the ship were very wealthy. And so the 2-week journey over to Cuba was characterized by parties, as you can see some pictures of at the bottom of the screen, and 5-star meals, and an overall atmosphere of joy because they were finally leaving Nazi Germany and would be able to get safety. The 2-week journey over, however, the immigration certificates, or not the immigration certificates, the landing certificates that had been given to the refugees instead of traditional immigration certificates were invalidated by the Cuban government, which was pro-fascist at the time. And so when the ship reached Havana in Cuba, all but 28 refugees were prohibited from leaving the ship. So they were stuck on the ship, and the American Joint Distribution Community actually sent a delegate to try to reason with Cuban officials, but the Cuban president refused, and so the ship made a desperate attempt to go to the United States. But likewise in the US, they were refused entry. And in 2012, the United States State Department actually apologized for the officials who refused the refugees' entry into the US during the Holocaust. But in 1939, the ship had to return back to Europe. They didn't have to go to Nazi Germany, however. Great Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands were the countries that accepted the remaining refugees on the ship. But only those who found refuge in Great Britain actually achieved relative safety. The rest of the people who immigrated or who moved to France, Belgium, and the Netherlands were once again subject to Nazi terror following Nazi Germany's invasion of Western Europe in spring of 1940. And by the very end of World War II and the Holocaust, 1/3 out of all the passengers who remained on the ship had been murdered or died during the Holocaust, while the remaining 2/3 survived. So as I kind of touched on earlier, immigrating or finding refuge during the Holocaust for Jews was a very, very difficult task. I mentioned immigration quotas, and a lot of countries had waiting lists that were several years long. So it was very difficult to actually move to a country. And they also had extensive documentation needed. You can imagine if you have a family of 4 and you each need, 10 documents to immigrate to another country, they all have to arrive at the exact same time. And if any of you have tried to get a passport, you know how difficult it is trying to coordinate passport arrival times within a family. So you can imagine how difficult it was to immigrate or to find refuge in another country, especially when a world war is going on. And a lot of countries weren't accepting immigrants during the time, and Hitler used this to fuel his argument that Jews were vermin and other countries didn't want them. And overall, the Dominican Republic was the only country that was willing to admit a significant number of refugees. They were willing to admit around 100,000 Jewish refugees, but they only gave out about 5,000 visas. And out of those 5,000, only 645 people actually found refuge in the Dominican Republic. Bolivia ended up admitting more. They admitted around 30,000 Jewish refugees. Palestine accepted 60,000. Shanghai accepted 17,000, such as the Roseanne family I mentioned previously. 30,000 were accepted into Switzerland. 100,000 made it to the Iberian Peninsula. The United States and Great Britain also accepted refugees, but in far lower numbers than I mentioned previously. They often cited national security concerns. Great Britain did accept 10,000 Jewish children under a special program known as Kindertransport, however. And I should mention before I move on that these numbers only reflect wartime numbers, and the post-war numbers are significantly different. Beginning March 1944, the United States War Refugee Board, or the WRB, proposed the opening of safe havens in the United States, also known as free ports. And through the free port system, refugees would be able to enter the United States outside of immigration quotas and then be repatriated to their country of origin after the war ended. And President Roosevelt, who was president of the United States at the time, was in full support of this idea. He thought that it was a wonderful idea, but he feared what his opponents in Congress would say. So he needed to find some way to work around in order to get the Freeport idea approved. So he asked the WRB if there was any situation where removal of refugees from refugee camps or transit camps would be favorable. And the WRB had been receiving reports that transit camps in southern Italy were overflowing with refugees and they couldn't take anymore. So President Roosevelt used the situation in order to get the idea of free ports approved by Congress. and Fort Ontario in Oswego, New York was selected as the Freeport's location. So they approved the idea in 1944, and 982 people were selected to make the journey over to Fort Ontario. Out of this group of 982, 75% came from transit camps in southern Italy, while 25% came from Rome. And they wanted to select Jews and non-Jews for the journey, but overall 918 out of the 982 people were Jewish. So they arrived at Fort Ontario on August 5th, and they were actually quite frustrated upon their arrival. Fort Ontario was a military base at the time, and they had barbed wire, and the refugees were prohibited from leaving the camp. They just weren't allowed to, and they couldn't visit family that lived in the United States. Some even had family in New York and neighboring cities, and they weren't allowed to visit them. They also weren't allowed to hold jobs or join the military. So it was very frustrating, and they were there for 18 months. But following the E-Day, pressure from Harry Truman's cabinet, Congress, Jewish organizations, and refugee organizations, Harry Truman announced that the refugees at Fort Ontario would be eligible for American visas. And a lot of the people who were refugees at Fort Ontario decided to do that. And ultimately, however, Fort Ontario was the only attempt that the United States made during the entire Holocaust in World War II to provide a safe haven for refugees on United States soil. A lot of diarists actually wrote about the difficulties of trying to find refuge during the Holocaust, and Salvaged Pages by Alexandra Zapruder is a chronicle of young people's diaries during the Holocaust. And this is probably one of my favorite pieces of Holocaust literature because it is so detailed and represents such a wide variety of experience. And while this collection of diaries is very varied in experience and situation, some of the diarists talk about the difficulties of trying to find refuge. There's this one boy's story, and he writes about how he was trying to immigrate to Palestine, but his documents didn't come in time. And so his father was trying to find all of these different places that he could go to. It's very, very detailed, very, very interesting. And if you would like to pick up a copy, it is available through the San Antonio Public Library in physical form. The Kladovo transport was an illegal transport of Central European Jews that were supposed to go to Palestine in fall of 1939. The original plan was for 1,200 refugees who were chosen by a group called Hehalutz. They were a Zionist youth group. And while Hehalutz was the main Zionist group that was represented within the 1,200 people, other Zionist affiliations and non-Zionist affiliation were chosen as well. But the main plan, the original plan, was for the group to gather in Bratislava. Then they were going to take a riverboat through Slovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, and Romania before reaching the Romanian port of Salina. Then from Salina, they would get on a transport vessel that would take them to Palestine via the Black Sea. When the group was supposed to convene in Bratislava, however, it became clear that no ship would await them at the port of Salina. And the Jewish organization that was leading the group decided that just waiting around would not be an option. So they decided to change their plans a bit. So the group gathered in Vienna before moving to Bratislava, where they officially began their journey. Then they took a riverboat between Hungary and Yugoslavia. But right before they reached the Iron Gate at the border of Romania, they were stopped by Yugoslav authorities. You see, Great Britain, who occupied Palestine at the time, had pressed upon Yugoslav authorities that they needed to stop illegal immigration to Palestine via the Black Sea. But Yugoslav authorities, when the group arrived, actually didn't say this at all. They cited the weather conditions. It was December, and they said that the river was about to freeze over, so it would be very dangerous for the group to proceed. So they told the group to go to the port of Kladovo and await warmer weather, and then they could sail on. And the group did as instructed. They went to the port of Kladovo, where they were helped by the Federation of Jewish Communities in Yugoslavia. And knowing that the group's stay would be extended, they set up social, cultural, and educational institutions to bide their time and keep them busy while they awaited the vessel that would take them to Palestine. And so they, were there for quite a while. The Jewish group actually sent around 600 or so of the people to live with local farmers as well, so that the port wouldn't be too crowded. And then in March 1941, or not March 1941, August actually, August of 1940, the group was moved to a refugee camp in Sabak. Then in March of 1941, 207 Zionist youth actually managed to legally take the journey to Palestine. They organized all of the documents that arrived in a transport vessel, and they were actually able to move to Palestine. The people who weren't able to do so remained in Sabak. And following Germany's invasion and occupation of Yugoslavia a few weeks after the group of 207 left, they were conscripted into forced labor at a concentration camp called Sava. And by the end of the Holocaust, only one person out of the entire group that had remained in Yugoslavia survived. Illegal immigration to Palestine prior to the founding of the State of Israel is one of the most fascinating chapters of Zionist and Jewish history. And in her book, Escaping from the Holocaust, Illegal Immigration to the Land of Israel, 1939 to 1941 by Dalia Ofer, examines this unique chapter of history. And she talks about the difficulties of illegally immigrating to a country, as well as what it was like for officials in countries where illegal immigration was very common. She also talks about activist organizations and people who tried to find illegal immigration to Palestine. So if you're interested in reading this book, it's available in the San Antonio Public Library System in physical form. Post-war immigration after World War II and the Holocaust posed a significant set of challenges that were very different than immigration during the Holocaust. Health was a very big factor in post-war immigration. A lot of death camp and concentration camp survivors were severely malnourished and emaciated. They were often described as walking skeletons, and some of them couldn't even leave their beds. And actually, a significant number of death camp survivors died post-liberation because of their bodily trauma. For those who did gain a general sense of health and mobility, they often feared returning to their home countries because of existing anti-Semitism. You see, just because the war had ended didn't mean that anti-Semitism had also ended. It was very ingrained in the political culture of many European countries at the time. And some who did return home were the victims of pogroms or anti-Jewish riots, the largest of which occurred in Poland, and 42 Jews were murdered and killed, while hundreds more were brutally injured. They also faced some similar difficulties to during the war immigration, such as closed borders, quotas, and restrictions, and heavy documentation, like I mentioned previously. Overall, post-Holocaust, the United States, South America, Palestine, and Australia accepted the most number of refugees. Age and reliance also played a role in a person's ability or where they immigrated to. For very young people, their immigration destination was often chosen by surviving family members or youth organizations that had taken in orphans. For very old survivors, they were often reluctant to leave Europe. and figures relating to the age distribution of immigrants to Palestine between 1946 and October 1948 reveal that the highest percentage of immigrants were between the ages of 15 and 29, with a significant decrease in migration in those 30 years old and over. I mentioned that gender played a role in a person's ability to immigrate. Pregnant women who were 7 months pregnant and over were often barred from immigrating to certain countries. Were considered a liability. But even women in their 9th month of pregnancy did manage to illegally immigrate to different countries post-Holocaust. Political and cultural affiliation also was a big factor in some people's decision to immigrate. Zionism, for example, was a big factor in influencing people to move to Palestine prior or after the Holocaust and World War II. On the screen are Emil and Elsie Goldberg, who married after 10 years of dating in 1937. They had 3 children, Edwin, who's also pictured on the screen, who was born in 1938. They also had 2 daughters, Eva and Latka, who were born after the Holocaust. Emil worked as a dentist, and he was drafted into the Polish military, where he became head of a military unit. Elsie, who owned an embroidery shop, hid a Polish civilian uniform or clothing in his Polish military gear. And so when the Polish front began to break, Emil put on his civilian clothing and he mingled with the general Polish population. The couple had agreed that if anything were to happen, they would meet up in Lvov. So when the Polish front broke, the couple met up. Elsie took their son and Emil met them there. And Emil's brother, sister-in-law, and their child lived in Lvov, so they stayed with them. But mysteriously, a few days after their arrival, Emil's brother, sister-in-law, and their son mysteriously disappeared. And despite all efforts, their whereabouts and what actually happened to them is still unknown. But Emil and Elsie remained, and in March of 1940, or was it June of 1940, Soviet authorities rounded up Polish refugees living in the area and deported them to Siberia. And conditions were deplorable in Siberia for the family. They didn't have any medicine, they didn't have enough food, it was filthy, and disease spread very rampantly. Elsie actually had to sell her rings and a lot of the family's personal belongings in order to get food and basic necessities for the family. I mentioned that disease was very common, and Edwin, at the age of 2, ended up contracting spinal tuberculosis. He was in a full body cast for 4 years, and then sadly, 2 days before his 6th birthday, he died because of his tuberculosis. The couple was struck by grief, but after World War II and the Holocaust ended, they were able to immigrate back to Poland. They remained there for a number of years, and they had their 2 daughters, Eva and Latka. Then, in 1957, the couple immigrated to Palestine via Italy on a Greek ship, and they lived in Palestine until their deaths in 1978 and 1999. The Goldbergs weren't the only family that were relocated to the Soviet Union during the Holocaust. Movement of Jews to the USSR during the Holocaust is actually the largest Jewish migration in history. And Albert Kanganovich explores this portion of history in Exodus and its aftermath. He talks about the unique difficulties of Jews who lived in the Soviet Union during World War II, as well as the anti-Semitism that existed there, what it was like to deal with USSR officials, and overall explores this large migration. So if you're interested in reading, it is not available through the San Antonio Public Library System, but I would highly recommend it for all who are interested. The Buchenwald boys were a group of approximately 1,000 child survivors of Buchenwald concentration camp, which was liberated by the United States on April 11th, 1945. And after the camp was liberated, United States liberators didn't know what to do with such a large group of orphans. And so American Army chaplains connected outside organizations to the group, and they organized for groups of boys to be sent to France, England, and Switzerland. And surviving family members attempted to be located when the group was sent to these locations. Some boys were able to meet up with surviving family members in Palestine, but for the groups that remained, they were either sent to vocational training courses or homes where they were given an education. I particularly like to tell the story of the two boys at the bottom of the screen. The boy on the left is named Naphtali, and the boy on the right is named Israel. They were brothers, and as you can probably tell by the photo, Naphtali is significantly older than Israel. He was actually 11 years older. And during the Holocaust, they were with their father and their mother, but their father made Naphtali promise that he would take care of Lulek, or Lulek was Israel's nickname. So he made him promise that he would take care of Israel. And Naphtali kept this promise. His father knew that the family was likely to be separated, and so he wanted the two boys to remain together. He also made Naphtali promise that after the Holocaust ended, he would ensure that Israel got a religious education. He was a rabbi, and his father was a rabbi going back generations. And so he wanted to make sure that the family's rabbinical legacy remained unbroken. So the boys remained together throughout the entire course of the Holocaust. And after liberation, Naphtali was very sick with typhus. But upon his recovery, the boys were sent to a home in France. And Naphtali was anxious to immigrate to Israel. So when they were able to, they immigrated and they met up with their half-brother, whom Israel had never met before and whom Naphtali had not seen for 12 years because they'd been separated during the Holocaust. Keeping his promise to his father, however, he made sure that Israel got religious education. And Israel actually was appointed chief rabbi of the state of Israel in 1993, and he served in this position until 2003. And his son, David, was appointed the current chief rabbi of the state of Israel, where he still serves. Israel is still alive. He is 84 years old and still lives in Israel. And so the family's rabbinical legacy has remained unbroken. Naphtali died at the age of 88 in 2014, but he went on to become an Israeli diplomat, journalist, and author. Boy from Buchenwald, The True Story of a Holocaust Survivor is the memoir of Robbie Weitzman. And he was one of the Buchenwald boys. And in his memoir, he talks about the Holocaust, what his experiences of the Holocaust was. And he also talks about how he overcame incredible loss and suffering in order to find incredible joy later on in his life. So if you're interested, this book is available in physical form in the San Antonio Public Library system. Before I end my presentation, I'd like to leave you all with two quotes. The first of which is by Elie Wiesel, a Holocaust survivor and Nobel laureate, who said, "I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. We must take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the tormentor, never the tormented." The second quote is by Anne Frank, who was a Holocaust victim and diarist. And I feel like this quote sums up the message of the Holocaust Museum in San Antonio, and I find it very meaningful and inspiring in my own personal life. She said, "How wonderful is it that nobody need wait a single moment before starting to improve the world?" So I said I would have a comprehensive list of the book recommendations from my presentation today. So I'll leave it up for a few moments so that you can take a screenshot or a picture if you would like. All right. So I'd like to thank you all for being here today, and I'm now open to any questions you may have. For more information about the Holocaust and stories of refuge, I would highly encourage you all to check out the Holocaust Memorial Museum of San Antonio at hmmsa.org. And now that you know, what will you do? So thank you. So I am open to any questions.
Hello, this is Cynthia, the co-moderator. Are there any questions?
I have a question. Actually, it's about a book, and I have to look it up. There was a book I read many years ago called The Exodus, and it sounded similar to one of the stories that you told. Are you familiar with that? It was about a boat that they wouldn't let on shore, and the people didn't have food and were there for a long time.
I've not heard of that book, but it sounds very interesting. I would be interested.
I'm going to research it. Thank you.
Any other questions? You can also send me questions in the chat.
If not, and if any questions pop up at a later time, feel free to email me. My email was CC'd on the Zoom link that you got today. So if anything pops up or any question arises, feel free to email me and I'll try to get back to you as fast as I can.
Well, Reyna, I want to thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I'm really glad you could be with us today and that you could give us this wonderful information. I would like to thank everybody who participated in the program today. Thank you very much for attending. Holocaust Learn and Remember programming does continue. You can go to mysapl.org, our website, in order to see what else is coming up through our events calendar, or stop by your local branch and ask for any information about other Holocaust Learn and Remember programs that are coming up. I do want to mention that there is a photography exhibit that is taking place at the Westfall Branch Library. You can contact Westfall or your local library and get more information about that exhibit. And if no one has any questions, we'll go ahead and I will stop the recording, and we will end the session. So I'm going to hit stop record now.